المعالي أصحاب السعادة، السيدات والسادة الحضور في المؤتمر ومن يتابع فعالياته خلف الشاشات. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. نرحب بكم مرة أخرى، هذه المرة في جلسة المتحدث الرئيسي لهذا اليوم من المؤتمر الدولي لتقويم التعليم والتدريب، تجويد نواتج التعليم ودعم النمو الاقتصادي، الذي تنظمه هيئة تقويم التعليم والتدريب بالشراكة مع الأمانة السعودية لمجموعة ال20. It's our pleasure to welcome you again to the first keynote speech of the International Conference on Education and Training Evaluation, Improving Learning Outcomes and Supporting Economic Growth. جلسة المتحدث الرئيس لهذا اليوم بعنوان العائد الاقتصادي لجودة التعليم، يدير حوارها معالي الأستاذ فيصل الإبراهيم، نائب وزير الاقتصاد والتخطيط. The first keynote speech is titled Economic Returns to Quality Education. The speech by His Excellency Faisal Alibrahim, Vice Minister at the Ministry of Economy and Planning. فليتفضل معاليكم مشكورا. Please welcome His Excellency.
شكرا. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to be here virtually with all of you today. I thank the Education and Training Evaluation Commission for organizing this important conference, as it is a chance to bring together national and international experts to explore some of the contemporary issues surrounding education and its evaluation. The custodian of the two holy mosques, King Salman, once said, "Education in Saudi Arabia is the necessary base which will help realize the aspirations of our people towards progress and advancement in science and knowledge." Organized education in the kingdom started with the establishment of the Directorate of Knowledge in 1925, which was the cornerstone of official education. It was a precursor for the establishment of the Ministry of Education in 1953. Today, and under Vision 2030, the kingdom continues its commitment to provide quality education to all. This is evident in the education sector, commanding around 20% of government spending. It was with this confidence and determination that the Ministry of Education collaborated with the Ministry of Health to spread awareness over COVID-19, as education is present in every home. The government prepared response scenarios and plans to increase its adaptability and readiness with continued monitoring and adjusting. The Ministry of Education rolled out multiple platforms for remote learning, equipped families and teachers to adapt accordingly, and instilled policies to sustain the education process and minimize loss. In a rapidly changing global economy, education is critical to empowering and advancing human capabilities, with early childhood education as a key milestone of a successful learning journey. Under its G20 presidency, the kingdom acknowledges that fostering education is a key component for empowering people. The G20 ought to continue efforts that enable future generations to reach their full potential. These efforts include fostering internationalization in education to develop the competence and skills needed to prosper in our globalized world. Looking forward, we recognize that education faces evolving challenges at every stage of development that all countries and societies have to overcome. Hence, we must invest in foreseeing these challenges and deploying creative solutions in all educational streams: foundational, theoretical, practical, technical, and vocational, to turn these challenges to positive opportunities. The kingdom realizes that education is an investment in human capital and always encourages public, private, and non-profit sectors to collaborate in improving education quality and output to propel us to socioeconomic prosperity and resilience. Before we move forward, I'd like to remind our audience to send the questions via the chat function available online. And now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Erik Hanushek to take us through the education challenge in Saudi Arabia. Professor Hanushek is a Paul and Jean Hanna Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution of Stanford University. He is actually joining us from there in Palo Alto, California. He is a pioneer in the development of economic analysis of educational issues, and his widely cited research spans many policy areas and has broad influence on education policy in both developed and developing countries. His current research analyzes why some countries' school systems consistently perform better than others. In addition, his recent book, The Knowledge Capital of Nations, Education and the Economies of Growth, summarizes his research establishing the close links between countries' long-term rates of economic growth and the skill levels of their populations. He is a distinguished graduate of the United States Air Force Academy and completed his PhD in economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Professor Hanushek, welcome.
Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, it is a distinct honor to be invited to participate in this very important conference. And I'm sorry that I have to stay in California because of the pandemic, but I appreciate the ability to do this video. The discussion I want to give today doesn't deal with the current immediate crisis caused by the pandemic. It instead looks at the longer term issues that I think are important and should be driving much of the discussion. Let me quickly outline what I want to talk about today. The first thing is to emphasize how vitally important education is to economic growth. And the second part, building on that linkage between education and growth, I want to discuss what is the value, the economic value of cognitive skills. And I'm going to do this in the context of the Saudi Arabian economy. And finally, I will quickly sketch some policy options that I see from the international literature. I don't think I have to really motivate this talk very much. The Vision 2030 clearly states the direction in which the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is aiming, but it also in the background, we see the fiscal problems caused by the current world environment and the need for economic growth. What I'm going to talk about is that the future of Saudi Arabia really depends upon an improvement of educational quality. That's what the existing research says without any question. And from that, I'll give some priorities for the education sector and talk a little bit about the external complications for education policy. Vision 2030 lays out the need to develop a viable non-oil private sector. And that's what we see as we look around the world. The underlying message that I can't say too often is that economic growth depends upon the skills of the population. What we've seen when we look across countries is that the skills of the workforce in different countries determine what the long-term growth rate will be, and thereby the long-term economic viability of each economy. The current K-12 education system in Saudi Arabia does not support a high level of economic growth that's based upon a knowledge-based, skill-based economy. And while there's a lot of discussion of early childhood, which is important, and of higher education, which is also important, and of non-cognitive skills, these are not the things to focus on in the immediate short run, in my opinion. My opinion comes from looking at what drives economic growth around the world. Now, education and growth have been the topic of research by economists for about the last quarter century. Economists became intrigued with the question of why do some countries grow faster than others? And in all of this work, looking at a variety of things from international trade to the way the government is organized to the amount of regulation, every analysis, in fact, includes a measure of the human capital. And for much of this period, the research behind economic growth was centered on how many years of schooling does the population get in each country. So this graph is something, let me describe it quickly because it highlights what I want to get into. The horizontal axis is conditional years of schooling. I'll explain conditional in a second. The vertical axis is the rate of economic growth over the long term. This picture looks at 1960 to 2000 growth rates. And all of these countries identified here have both different levels of schooling and different growth. They go from Venezuela at the very bottom to Singapore and Taiwan and Korea up at the top. So this shows the basic relationship that suggests that the more schooling the population has, the higher the rate of growth. And this is part of the research of economists over the last quarter century. The only other thing that I should tell you about this graph is that it's entirely wrong. This is not the correct graph. The correct graph is this one. And this has, instead of years of schooling on the horizontal axis, it has test scores. Think of test scores as the PISA test, for which we have scores from Saudi Arabia and a large number of other countries. And the vertical axis is, again, the conditional growth rate. Conditional here just means in the background, we've allowed for the starting point of each country in their growth. If a country starts behind with low level of economic development, it's possible to grow faster simply by copying what everybody else does. If a country is more developed and at the frontier of production, it has to invent new things, and that's harder. But once we allow for that, we get this very strong relationship between test scores, which measure the knowledge, the math and science skills of people in different countries, against long-term growth rates, growth between 1960 and 2000. What you see here is a nice positive relationship that countries that show that the students are learning more develop into having better workforces, and that promotes growth. The other thing you see in this graph is that all of the countries are pretty close to that line. In other words, this explains a majority of differences in growth. Now, let me go back to the prior graph. We had years of schooling, which people concentrated on for a long time, from the World Bank to individual countries, of getting everybody in schooling. But if we take into account what people are learning in each year of schooling, we get a very different line. In the bottom right here, we have conditional years of schooling against growth rates after we take into account how well people do on these math and science tests, how much they learned. And what you see is a perfectly flat line, that years of schooling doesn't count if you don't learn anything when you're in school. That's what that's saying. Now let me, the first question that people always ask, is this a causal relationship? If I can see a way to increase the skills in any country, do we expect the growth rate to go up? It could be that higher growth just causes more and better education, or that there are other omitted factors, cultural differences across countries, regulations, other institutions like openness of the economy and so forth. I don't have time to go into the details here, but let me just say, after extensive research, I think I can say pretty definitively, there's a strong case that this is a causal relationship, that improving skills does in fact lead to faster growth. Now let me put this into the context of Saudi Arabia. This graph in two parts shows the performance on mathematics according to the PISA test that was given in 2018. The PISA test just takes a math problem, translates it into the local language, and marches it around the world and sees how many people can answer this question in different countries. It's a test given to 15-year-olds. And what this shows is the average score in mathematics. At the very top left-hand corner is the Dominican Republic, which scored the lowest amount of any country in the 2018 PISA test. And it goes down to the bottom right where we have Singapore and Macau and Hong Kong and a variety of other countries that are at the top. The countries in green are the countries on the Arabian Peninsula that participated in the PISA test. And at the top, closer to the level of the Dominican Republic, is Saudi Arabia. Now that, it turns out, is a real inhibition to future growth unless that can be turned around. Let me give you an example. Go back to the picture I showed you, in which test scores determine growth rates. If I put Saudi Arabia on that picture, it's down near the bottom. And that's not where the kingdom wants to be in the future. And that's not what's called for under Vision 2030. Let me tell you how steep that line is. If we look at growth in the future, these are years into the future for the rest of the century, and how much larger is GDP, gross domestic product, in Saudi Arabia each year into the future. With the current workforce, we project a line like this, so that by about 2045, the GDP of Saudi Arabia is 50% bigger than it is today. If in fact we could improve the skills and the education of the population, you could expect, according to historical patterns, a faster growth rate, like the red line in this graph. And what I'm going to do is just show you how much difference is that. I'm going to add up the amount of higher GDP throughout the remainder of the century so that we can see what happens. Let's take a simple example. Saudi Arabia moves up to the level of Jordan, which, as you saw before, is a bit ahead of the kingdom on the 2018 scores. The value of that is the present value, adding up the difference in those two growth curves, is $3.8 trillion. That means that on average, GDP for the remainder of the century is 5% higher GDP per capita, or think of that as every worker in Saudi Arabia has a 10% higher paycheck for the remainder of the century. A second level, which I'll just skim over, these are figures for 2015. And in fact, the schools and education in Saudi Arabia has improved since 2015, although not hugely. In 2015, 30% of the population was not completing lower secondary schooling. And according to the test scores in 2015, 78% of the population of the students were not going to be internationally competitive in the labor market. Bringing everybody into school and up to basic levels of skills would imply almost a 10 times larger GDP in present value. The present value would be 10 times current GDP, or over $15 trillion. And we're talking about 40% higher paychecks for every worker in Saudi Arabia for the remainder of the century. Now, the current PISA scores say, well, things have improved so that only 73% are below a basic internationally competitive level. But that's the challenge. Now, there are lots of options, and I will just quickly go over these so we can have time for some questions. But the answer that all research gives is that the focus has to be on teacher policy. It has to be developing effective teachers, and that's what will drive education in Saudi Arabia in the future. There's very little evidence that you can do this simply by trying to strengthen the teacher colleges or by providing more professional development. What's really needed is a reliable evaluation system for teachers and incentives to make sure that effective teachers stay in the classroom and teach a large proportion of the students. Part of this, given the position of Saudi Arabia, probably also implies going to international markets to bring in teachers that are trained from other places in the short run while you develop your own teaching force. The priorities in my mind are measuring performance. There's no way to improve without accurate and continuous measuring of the cognitive skills of the population. And then rewarding those schools that in fact produce high levels of learning for each year. Now, there is a role for early childhood education, as His Excellency pointed out in the introduction, and that's preparing students for schools. But just working on early childhood will not lead to the results you want unless the K-12 system is also improved. And there's also room for improved vocational training, but that can't come at the expense of general basic skills. What we found is that having the basis of cognitive skills is extraordinarily important, and we can't do away with that just by providing skills for the immediate workforce, because if the economy grows and the non-oil sector part of the Saudi economy grows, that means the jobs will change in the future. And we have to have workers that are prepared to adapt to a different environment. Now, one of the other policies is that there, in my opinion, there's a lot of room for an educational exception to any restrictions on immigration, because you have to fill in the teaching force in the short run as you develop your own. Now, I will just briefly mention, because it's not the center of this, there are external complications to the education sector, and so it has to struggle a little bit more. One is that the current distortions in the private labor market reduce incentives for people to be skilled and work in the private labor market. Secondly, I know that there's been a real emphasis recently on developing entrepreneurial skills and an entrepreneurial culture. There's still a challenge there and a ways to go, but that's got to be part of the innovative economy of the future. And there's a need for bringing in immigrants to fill in the Saudi population with skilled workers while you develop your own. All of these essentially provide low student incentives now, because the students have to be interested in learning too. And that's the external challenge. Your Excellency, I might stop here and go to questions rather than guess at where people would like to discuss things.
Thank you very much, Professor. I think we have some questions. I'll start with one that we have, the team and I have arranged earlier. I believe when you were mentioning the need to look at these policy options moving forward, I think also what you're asking for is that the investment that's been made in education over the past century or so, and the output that came with it was a clear sign of fast progress and good results. And what you're talking about today is jumping 10 ranks in the score will do a world of good in terms of impact on the economy. And I believe the leadership's ambition is to not just jump 10 ranks, but even to be at par with the top countries, G20 and otherwise, with regards to educational outcomes at all levels. And I believe we are heading in that direction. We've discussed some examples earlier on labor market policies, but also education policy and educational reform. And I think the notion of not basking in the glory of great achievements that we're proud of, but also looking at the realities today and seeing what else needs to be done. The step change that happened years ago needs to be followed with more step changes. So I'd like to ask a question, and if we can get your transparent input, please, with regards to education policy and education evaluation. How do you feel today's setup in the kingdom in terms of all the stakeholders related to evaluation of education and delivery of education are designed? Do you feel that from looking at the governance, from looking at the structure, from looking at the setup, for lack of another term, how do you feel effective? How effective do you feel it is, and what do you feel is missing, and what we should look at in terms of focus? I believe we are looking at all aspects, but what do you think is an area that you believe focus on will yield higher returns?
Thank you for that question. Let me, before I directly address that, just reinforce what you suggested before. The kingdom has made great movements in terms of providing education. It's just that by the international test, it has not brought the students up to currently competitive levels by the rest of the world. The rest of the world is also making these attempts to improve. It is possible to improve. We look at a number of countries that have shown that they can get large gains, like Peru, which started with performance near the level of Saudi Arabia in the last 15 years, has jumped ahead of the ranks that I talked about. So improvement is possible. Now, what I think has been missing is a accurate evaluation system that records the student performance, that links the student performance to the schools they're in, and not in a simplistic way tries to adjust for the backgrounds of students, but then also see what is the contribution of the schools, and to make that a very public statement, make it transparent, and to provide incentives for it. That turns out to be a difficult job. It takes work to get to that point, but it is possible, and a number of countries have shown that by improving the evaluation of students, by linking that and making it transparent, and by providing incentives for performance, improvements are really possible.
Clear. Thank you, Professor. The other question we also had, there's this debate that we've discussed earlier with regard to the impact of the pandemic on educational outcomes in the long term. People argue that this will be a permanent damage, if you will, a permanent gap that needs to be addressed somehow, and others feel that no, the current solutions will suffice and kind of address that gap or mitigate it as much as possible. What's your opinion on this, and how detrimental do you feel it is, if it is, and what are the ways we can mitigate these negative, let's say, impact?
And that's a very important question, Your Excellency, particularly given the challenges that we're faced with this virus. I think that the first alternative that you sketched is the one that is the most likely, and that is that there's a permanent damage to students who were affected last spring by the school closures. So if we return our schools to the level of schools in 2019, before we knew that there was a crisis and before the virus was present, we will have a permanent harm to the current population. It will be seen as a permanent harm to the Saudi economy in the future, because your workforce and your society will have less learning in the future. So the only alternative, in my opinion, is to find ways to make the schools better than they were in 2019. Now, that's part of your overall objective anyways, to do that. But in the face of the pandemic, I could suggest two straightforward ways that build upon what we've learned during this awful time of school closures and disruption. The first is, as we return to the classroom or maybe video at-home lessons, what we'll see is that there's a much larger variation in the learning preparation of students coming into any classroom. In some classrooms, for example, I suspect in your home, there's a lot of education going on with your daughter. But there are other places where there's not much education going on at the home, even if they have the technology to do it. And what that's going to do is lead to a much larger variation in the preparation of students. We have known before the pandemic that we should focus the education system more on the individual student and where they are, and provide education for the individual student instead of hitting some average for what we expect those in grade 4 to know when they come into school. So we can use this experience, which is easier now that we have a lot more technology in the classroom, to individualize the instruction. The second thing that we're, I think, seeing out of this pandemic is that as you look over the shoulder of your children and see what the lessons are going on, some teachers are just better at providing this video instruction than others. That's something that we knew when we had in-class instruction. Some teachers were just better than others at providing in-class instruction. And I don't think that they're necessarily the same teachers, by the way, that provide good video instruction versus good in-class instruction. But we've known for some time that we should use the ones who are good at something more intensively. We should use the ones who are better at video instruction to teach more students. We should use the ones that are better at in-class instruction to teach more students, to be more effective, and to provide other balancing forces. In other words, we should manage the teaching force based upon their effectiveness, and we should emphasize that. If we do that, we could end up with a much better school system.
Very clear, Professor. I think you mentioned again the idea of evaluating and managing the quality of teachers and helping them and enabling them to perform better and support them in their ambitions as well, but also in the ambitions of the education system. I had to tiptoe through, despite being virtual lessons, I had to tiptoe through some actual school projects to get here, leaving home. So I still believe some teachers are more ready to do this than others, and I believe that's an area to address and support the rest of the cohort, if you will. We have a question about test scores and their limitations. What do you feel is a good way to mitigate the limitation of test scores and their, indicative, let's say, value of the education system?
Well, test scores don't completely measure what education is all about. If I know the math score of somebody in grade 6 and how much any teacher or school added to that math score, that doesn't indicate the breadth of activities of that school and the amount of learning. So we have to be careful that we don't rely exclusively on test scores, and that we take into account other aspects of schools. At the same time, if we went back to the picture I showed you, these test scores that we get, such as the PISA scores, I'll just use that as an example, these test scores really indicate a lot about the skills of the population that are important. And there's a tendency today of people to try to minimize the importance of test scores. It's not the test scores itself. It's the amount of learning and the cognitive skills that are developed in the schools. And these tests are just quick indicators of them, but it's the learning that's important. And we cannot avoid that. If we try to avoid test scores and just say, well, everybody knows what a good education is, we're going to end up in a bad position.
Clear, Professor. Another question, if you don't mind. What significant factors led comparable countries to improve drastically in the past decade? What interventions would you say?
I think what we're seeing is that there's not one single thing that led some countries to improve. What we've seen is that some countries have introduced good evaluation systems and pushed relentlessly on those. Others have worried much more about the training of teachers. Others have spent more time thinking about how we manage the teaching force and place students in different classes. There's a wide variety of experiences, and that's where your education people have to be sensitive to the kinds of things that are in the background, the context for Saudi schools. At the same time, there are some common threads. I don't think that there's any country in the world that has improved without a good evaluation system of their students, without knowing where they're at. It's like running a business without a profit and loss statement. It's really hard to know how to improve if you don't know where you're at. Also, it looks like across countries that having more choice of schools for the parents helps, because parents can place their child in a school that's better for them or not, as opposed to rigid assignment practices. And then finally, incentives in the system in various ways for school administrators, for teachers, for students. You can provide a variety of incentives for the students themselves by whether they go on to schooling depending upon their performance.
We have a question on incentives, the professor. From your experience, from your vast experience, what incentives work best with teachers?
Well, there's a lot of controversy about incentives for teachers. I think that depends very much on the local context. But the first principle is that you have to recognize effectiveness and you have to find ways of rewarding it. It might be that you have different salaries. It might be that you have different support services. It might be that you provide a summer vacation for the best teachers. It might be a variety of different ways, but that it's geared to who is doing an effective job as opposed to just how old are they, how much experience do they have, which tends to drive many school systems today.
Professor, I think we have time for one or two more questions. I have a question with regards to expanding beyond education to elements or components of human capital development. Any thoughts on if there are interventions outside of education? Of course, they have impact, and their best, let's say, most valuable, most highest return in terms of catching up and maybe trying to be ahead of peers, if you will.
Well, first, I mean, the entire labor market and the operations of the rest of the economy provides many of the incentives for students to do well and for schools to get better. And so the structure of the rest of the economy is important. What we haven't been very good at is remedial programs for adults. You know, if we have people that didn't get the skills when they were young. We haven't been very good at worker training programs for adults in most places. There are some that work, but in general, that isn't the effective way. And so the just trying to provide more training on the job doesn't necessarily make up for poor skills that the people bring to the labor market.
Clear, Professor. I think one of today's key messages is for us to overcome this challenge of the pandemics, focusing more on the pandemic right now. We will probably have to make use of this crisis and let it not go to waste, as some people have said, and in order to, let's say, leapfrog, continue our journey to improvement, but maybe leapfrog, not only to cover the potential detrimental damage that the crisis has caused this class, if you will, but also to utilize this crisis in order to make even a stronger or more robust and more brave or courageous step change. Any last thoughts with regards to how we can look at this or internalize this as we are moving ahead?
I just have to underscore what you just said, is that during the crisis, it may offer a chance to improve on the operations of schools in ways that we know we should be doing, but find difficult to do in normal times. If we're just going along, we just keep going along and it's too hard to make changes. Here we know we have to make changes. We know we have a group of students that has been harmed, and we know we have the challenges that face the Saudi economy in the future. And there's no option if, in fact, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is to meet its destiny, there's no option other than improving the schools.
Very clear, Professor. I'd like to, from the heart, thank you for your candid insights and sharing your thoughts today. I'd also like to thank the audience for their persistent questions, and I apologize not being able to tackle or pose most of them to you, Professor. I'd also like to thank His Excellency Dr. Hussam Zaman and the great team, the fantastic team that organized this event for their hard work. Thank you once again, Professor, and we look forward to seeing you in person soon.
I would like to do that. Hopefully we have an opportunity to meet in the future.
Definitely. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thanks.
شكرا معاليكم. Thank you, Your Excellency. شكرا لحسن استماعكم. بهذا تنتهي جلسة المتحدث الرئيس لهذا اليوم. نلقاكم بعد وقفة قصيرة في بيان ختام اليوم الأول للمؤتمر الدولي لتقويم التعليم والتدريب. Thank you for your participation. We conclude our first keynote speech of the conference. We will have a quick 4 minutes break. Then we are going to announce the final thoughts and conclusions of the first day of the International Conference on Education and Training Evaluation. نلقاكم بعد قليل. We will be back shortly. حضورنا الكرام ومتابعي فعاليات المؤتمر من خلف الشاشات، أهلا بكم من جديد. Our respectable audience will come back. نترككم الآن مع بيان ختام اليوم الأول للمؤتمر الدولي لتقويم التعليم والتدريب، تعلنه سعادة الدكتورة هيا العمراني عضو لجنة برنامج المؤتمر. Now we are going to announce the final thoughts and conclusions of the first day of the International Conference on Education and Training Evaluation. Please welcome Dr. Haya Al-Umrani, a member of the conference program committee, to announce it.
In
the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful, all praise due to Allah, peace and blessings be upon the Prophet Muhammad, his family and companions. In conclusion of the first day of the conference, we would like to express our gratitude to His Royal Highness, His Majesty, the Kingdom of King Salman bin Abdul Aziz, the Cousin of the two Holy Mosques, and the Crown Prince Muhammad bin Salman. With their directions, Saudi Arabia is going through a direction of digitalization and transformation in order to have a viable economy and a prosperous society, depending on the basic role of education in order to prepare the future generation providing them with the skills they need to success in this age of technological and knowledge transformation. From this point of start, EDEC organized this conference, gathering national and international elite of experts to discuss the most important and urgent ideas and practices related to the formulation of the systems of education and training and measuring their impact on the margin of the presidency of Saudi Arabia to the G20 summit under the title of Qualifying the Outcomes of Education and Supporting the Economic Growth. The opening speech was with the speech of His Excellency Dr. Ahmed Al Isa, the head of the board of directors of the Commission, focusing on the future prospects of the training and education and the challenges that we face in Saudi Arabia, which is considered one of the pillars of achieving the strategy of national transformation, which is ambition for Saudi Arabia in our direction towards a non-oil economy, focusing on the quality of education and finding solutions that will achieve sustainability of education under the crisis of COVID-19. After His Excellency, after that, Dr. Hussam Abdul Wahab, as the man, provided the experiences of Saudi Arabia in dealing with COVID-19 crisis, providing online achievement tests and acceptance tests, and the continuity of evaluation and accreditation through virtual visits. The Commission could provide online and host online acceptance and uh, final tests through AI and human monitoring in order to inspect and supervise students. Also, we continued doing virtual visits to the institutions using technologies of modern aspects in order to have partnerships with other programs and technologies as well in order to have online meetings with stakeholders as provided by a number of programs online as well. In addition to that, he spoke about the results of the evaluation study provided by the Commission to diagnose the reality of education under the crisis of COVID-19. Dr. Andrea Schleicher concluded the first session. He is from OECD, speaking about the importance of collecting data to develop education through the study of the evaluation and measurement mechanisms from a comprehensive point of view, starting with the learner, going to the teacher, the environment of the school and the system nationally, and also the international benchmark, taking consideration the pillars of the public policies formulating these outcomes and cultural, social, and related cultural and social contexts. He also spoke about the balancing between the different available options, balancing between reliability, conformity, and efficiency in order to measure the executed processes, measuring the impact and the tasks available. Also, the conference went on focusing on the processes of education and inspection of high quality for schools, speaking about a number of experiences like the Dutch, the experience from Holland, and the experiences of cultural contexts, historical contexts, political and legal contexts, and finding the clear way of quality of education that requires the efficiency of evaluators, assessors, tools, teachers, and the different mechanisms for quality control and assurance, which are main tools and milestones for the high quality inspection and evaluation processes for schools. In addition to that, a presentation was provided about assessing and quality and enhancing quality for transformation from the traditional way to towards qualification and towards partnership and improving comprehensive styles for schools. Then a presentation was provided to tackle the study of Arabic language, teaching Arabic language, the importance of Arabic language, and the challenges we are facing through some of the inquiries about how to teach and learn Arabic language, and how can that reflect the modern advance of society and the paradigm shift that we need to achieve in teaching Arabic language, and how the educational system to keep up with the national philosophy of teaching Arabic while preparing teachers, training them, and developing the curricula and the educational methodologies and the processes of measurement and assessment. The second session was concluded with a presentation about the national frame of development of assessment and accreditation in Saudi Arabia. After that, we had the second session speaking about the TVTC programs, speaking about the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia's program and experience in transformation and having partnerships with the labor market and the environments of education and the professional development. Through this second session, we had a number of presentations that were provided with a number of experiences like the Scottish experience that focused on the professional development and focus on other things that are important. For example, they spoke about apprenticeship and how the feedback is important and how to have agreements and partnerships with memorandum of understanding between the agencies of training and education and the environment of a labor market and employers and employment environment. Also, the role of equality was provided and the role of new technologies in the field of monitoring, inspecting, and following up with evaluation and the quality of education, getting over the geographical obstacles, especially under the crisis of COVID-19. The second session was concluded with a presentation about the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia's experience for the ETEC in terms of evaluation, its evaluation for the training and education agencies and its coordination with the labor market agencies. After that, we had the final speech for Dr. Erik speaking about the transformation of education in Saudi Arabia towards the strategy of national transformation, focusing in his speech on finding the strategy of the educational strategy that is national regarding the quality of education and improving the methods of evaluation and performance measurement and providing incentives through positively intensifying the good performance and enhancing the general skills. Evaluation plays the important role in measuring the quality of education, and providing these assessments and evaluations and measurements will provide good information and necessary information for those officials responsible for measuring the process and providing them to the decision makers in order to improve processes in all levels, starting from teachers, students, leaders of schools, going all the way to the system of education in general. So EDEC is concerned and keen on benefiting from the elite experienced speakers in this conference and benefiting from their papers and building our systems and evaluation and assessment in order to achieve our goals and uplifting the quality of education in Saudi Arabia and in contribution to achieving our ambitious vision and toward the sustainable growth through an effective learner who is able to compete in a variable society. It is our pleasure now to express our thankfulness and gratitude to all the participants, the speakers, and the audience, and we hope we meet you tomorrow with new experiences and presentations, national and international. Thank you and peace be upon you all.
شكرا لك دكتورة هيا العمراني. حضورنا الكرام، في ختام اليوم الأول للمؤتمر الدولي لتقويم التعليم والتدريب، نشكر أصحاب المعالي والسعادة والمتحدثين كافة على كلماتهم وعروضهم المميزة، ونشكر الجميع على الحضور والتفاعل. Our respectable audience, as we have reached the end of the first day of the International Conference on Education and Training Evaluation, we would like to thank their excellencies and all the speakers for their valuable speeches and presentations. We would also like to thank you for your participation. كما ندعوكم إلى متابعة جلسات المؤتمر التي تستأنف غدا من الساعة 1 ظهرا حتى الساعة 7 مساء بتوقيت الرياض. 10 صباحا إلى 4 عصرا بتوقيت غرينتش. كما ندعوكم إلى تحميل برنامج المؤتمر لمتابعة الجلسات. We invite you to continue following our thematic sessions and keynote speeches in the second day tomorrow, as we start at 1 p.m. until 7 p.m. Riyadh time, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. Greenwich time. We invite you to download the conference agenda and mobile app from the website to follow the conference sessions. شكرا جزيلا لكم وفي أمان الله.